Speed.
Okay, so can you, in complete sentences again, like, can you just talk about, you first read Heidegger, who Heidegger is?
Right,
what he
yes,
wrote?
okay. At the same time that I was reading Merleau Ponty in Professor Weil's living room, Heidegger, Merleau Ponty was translated, so it was accessible. Heidegger had not been translated. Being in Time, which is his most important book, published in Germany in 1927, was still not available in English when I was a graduate student in the 50s, which is, in retrospect, an amazing fact, because I think more and more people agree that that was the great philosophy book of the 20th century. Even enemies of Heidegger, who think his later work is bad, a famous philosopher named Jürgen Habermas still says that the Being in Time of Heidegger is the greatest philosophy book since Hegel, which is way back in 18-something. So anyway, I read it, and I read it as best I could in German, and I understood enough to see that I just thought it was true, that it was an amazingly good description of our way of being in the world, with hyphens as he writes it, meaning that we are just completely absorbed in dealing with the things that are around us in a way that when it's going well, there's no ego in it, and there's no private stuff going on in my mind. It's all out there in the world, which shows up as familiar and as sort of drawing me to do whatever needs to be done.
We're going to touch a lot on this, but of course, the instinctual reaction, at least I think, for someone who's not a philosopher, says, well, I have a brain, and it's inside my head, and I do have personal experiences. Even when I am interacting with the world, I experience it as me. I'm going to school, or I'm thinking about this, or so how is Heidegger's description on the most superficial level different from that?
That's funny. I thought you were going to say the opposite. Why is Heidegger and you bothering to say all this, that we are open heads turned toward the world? It's so obvious. How could anybody have missed it? But instead you're saying there are two good philosophical reasons that Descartes came up with to try to overthrow this view and make this inner seem important. So there are two inners. There's the brain, which is in my skull, and that's just irrelevant to this discussion, because we're discussing the phenomena. That is, yes, there's a brain, and yes, it's the causal basis of my experience, but I don't experience my brain, and I'm not my brain. It's just it's the plumbing doing the work that enables me to what? Well, the next thing is to say, to have private experiences, which I'm having all the time when I'm dealing with the world. And the answer to that is that more striking in Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. No, you don't have private experiences. You have experiences of that wall and those people and so forth, that when you're really absorbed in what you're doing, which is a lot of the time, you just disappear. As what does Sartre say? My ego, he talks about chasing a bus and desperately trying to catch it as it pulls away, and he says there is this attraction, this experience of, not even experience, there is the bus to be caught, and me, my ego has disappeared. And that's the way we are a lot of the time. It's interesting and important to realize that it took a lot of effort to get people to think that they were an ego with these inner experiences. And even, like you say, at least I'm having inner experiences at the same time I'm open to the world. The stages, I'll mention two, which are fascinating. How hard it was for people to think that way, because it's sort of wrong, really. It does happen that people have inner experiences. They have private moods sometimes, though mostly their moods are shared, like the mood at the party or the mood in the room. They have private experiences when things are going wrong. So then they start worrying, how am I going to do this? But generally, they're just absorbed in what's going on. Now, in Homer, it starts already to be interesting that maybe there is some kind of inner. So Homer talks about Odysseus who has this peculiar capacity, that being this very special sort of super person, that he can cry inwardly while his eyes remain dry as bone. And that's because apparently all the rest of the Greeks were, and it's true, the soldiers seem to be crying all the time over their dead friends and so forth. And at parties, dinner parties where they sang of the Trojan War, they were all in tears. But there was a way to have an inner experience of sadness and not show it. And that was news. But the most interesting news was Saint Jerome in, I don't know, roughly 300 AD. Augustine in his Confession says that people came from miles around to watch Saint Jerome read the Bible. Why would anybody do that? Because of the amazing fact that his lips didn't move and he was silent. The meaning was going directly from the pages into the privacy of his mind. And this is Augustine trying to convince people that there really is an inner, and that's where all the things that are important are going on. But I just tell you this because once upon a time it wasn't obvious that we had inner experiences accompanying our skillful action.
But obviously people had emotions all along. People felt happy or sad or afraid or...
Well, people had emotions, all right, and now they felt happy, sad. Well, somebody like Sartre or Merleau, Ponty or Heidegger, these are the three anti-Cartesian people of the middle of the last century. They would all say things looked sad. They didn't have an inner feeling of sad. Everything looked gray or depressing or something, or everything looked like it was challenging and bright and full of possibilities. It's only if they reflected on it, or if their feelings were out of sync with everything and they were in depression or something, then they would have inner feelings. But normally that things looked sad and attractive and challenging and frightening and all that. Things look that way. And it's just a kind of Cartesian idea that's because you're having this inner experience of fright. These are all the right things to object, and it's hard work, and really hard work for Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and Sartre and now me to work their way out of these Cartesian views that Augustine sort of started and Descartes perfected.
So let's talk about how Heidegger went about doing that and being in time, because he started with the very fundamental human activities, right? Very simple things of how we behave in the world. So can you just go through a little bit what his mission was and how we've been through his mission. How did he actually go about arguing this?
Of course. How did he go about overthrowing Husserl? It's sort of funny that he said in a lecture that...
But let's not talk about overthrowing Husserl because that's a little too technical and specific. Let's say talk about overthrowing this whole
Cartesian thing. Okay, how did he go about that? Well, with very simple examples and down-to-earth examples. He writes a lot about hammering, and he just as an example of the use of equipment. His big breakthrough is to talk about our basic way of being in the world as users of equipment. No philosopher had paid any attention to the fact that we sit in chairs and go outdoors and walk on floors and generally are surrounded by and constantly skillfully dealing with equipment. So he took hammering, and he pointed out that when the hammering is going well, the hammer withdraws, in his language, becomes invisible, and you are just sort of, as he would say, sort of poured into the work that you're doing. And even that, if you're very skillful, you could just, at your best, you would just sort of phase out and be in the flow of doing it without you or the hammer being anything that you're thinking about. And there's no you thinking about it. There's just hammering going on.
And so I'm going to keep insisting on the mainstream way of looking at that would be that you are unconsciously, thinking about using the hammer, right?
Yes, and that's a familiar and fascinating move, and that the move is to try to say, well, if this isn't the sort of conscious phenomena that I'm describing, then it must be unconscious. That's like a kind of joke which I like to tell when I confront this, and I confront it all the time. I did at MIT, where the computer people would always say, well, it's going on in our minds and in our brains, but we don't have to be conscious of it. Okay, consider the following. I mean, and a typical example was, I learned to tie my shoelaces by following some rule, this over that, and then this loop, and then through that. I don't know the rule anymore, but I can still tie my shoelaces, so I must be unconsciously following that rule. And I say that's like a bad joke. Suppose you say, when I learned to ride a bicycle, I had to use training wheels, and if I didn't have my training wheels on my bicycle, I couldn't ride it. Now I seem to be riding around, now that I've had some experience, without any training wheels. My training wheels must be invisible. That is because they're necessary for, so that's the same. So I must still be using that rule to tie my shoelaces. And what else then? Well, maybe there's an entirely different way the brain does it. Maybe it's just that each particular, after a lot of experience with any skillful thing, let's stick to shoelaces, each stage, when it's like this, then it looks like it's drawing me to do that, and when it's got in that stage, it draws me to do that. And if I just respond to each thing as it comes along and do what I'm attracted to do, voila, the shoelace gets tied. Something in the brain is causing it, but it isn't the brain operating with rules. It's the brain being what they now call a neural network. And yes, the neurons are all connected, and when you learn enough shoelace tying, the connections get changed, so that finally, when there's an input of this kind of stage of shoelace tying, there's an output of that kind of movement of the next stage. So what the moral is, the training wheels aren't invisible. One mode of processing, of doing things, has been replaced by another entirely different mode of doing things. And that's why you can now ride the bike flexibly and easily without any training wheels. And now make the big generalization. All the skills that you're learning, you have to, or many of them, you have to learn consciously. And that gives you the impression that you're still following those rules, even when they're unconscious. Heidegger's other example, the simple again, he tells the students, when you come into the classroom, you use the door, you turn the doorknob, you avoid the benches, but that's all so familiar to you that you don't have to think about it or be aware of it or pay any attention to it at all. Of course, you have to take account of it. Somehow your brain has been wired through by the doors and the doorknobs and stuff, so that you just do it. But in your experience, that you don't have to take any account of it consciously, and you don't have to take, and your brain doesn't have to take account of it unconsciously. That's thinking as if you were still thinking how to do it. Your brain is wired so that when you get, the door is, Heidegger says at one point, you experience the door not as a door, but the two go out. And when you're in the familiar room, you experience the benches as to avoid or to sit on, and that's just direct. They just draw you that way. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to just talk about now.
Wait, no, I want to say one more thing.
Yes.
And take the door and the doorknob, for instance, because it's important to say, and if anything goes wrong, you get into this Cartesian mode. So if the doorknob sticks, then there's you paying attention to the doorknob, trying to figure out what to do about it, and you do seem like a conscious subject with an ego who's got rules for dealing with doorknobs and is appealing to them. But that just shows that all the stuff that you may have had to learn is still there and comes out to help you in breakdown cases. But, and this is the big Heidegger point, you don't want to read the breakdown cases back into the normal coping cases as something you're either dimly aware of or something you're not even aware of but you're unconsciously doing. They're gone.
Can we talk about how this applies to learning how to drive a car?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so when I drive my stick shift Carmen Gia, you want to know how it feels to drive a car. Well,
first how you learn to drive a car,
okay,
how it changes when you're good.
Yeah, when you start to learn. So let's do this with driving a car, and so I'll describe my car, which is a old stick shift car, and what do I do? Well, for one thing, I have no awareness of what I do. But let's start, when I learned to do it, I had to say, push on the clutch, then shift into second gear, then let up the clutch, and also in the meantime, to step on the gas. It's amazing anybody can learn to do even that sort of complicated thing, and you have to do it at exactly the right moment. And if you're on an uphill, which is typical of Berkeley, it's terrifying because you start coasting backward if you don't step on the gas soon enough, and it stalls. Teaching my kids to drive the Carmen Ghia. It was really scary for them and for me. Okay, so you learn this complicated bunch of rules, and you learn to listen to things like the motor is turning too fast, you better shift to a higher gear, or the sound of the motor racing, you better shift to a the motor's straining, you better shift to a lower gear, and you know what that sounds like. Finally, the motor is straining, you better shift to a higher gear, you know what that sounds like. And finally, all that stuff gets into your brain in terms of whatever the neural networks do, the weights on the connections between the neurons. Finally, that's what people think. And what happens, and how do you experience it? What's the phenomenology, to talk in the philosophy jargon? Well, the phenomenology of me driving the Ghia, as opposed to my kids learning, is I have no idea what I'm doing. While I'm carrying on a conversation about philosophy, my foot goes on the clutch, my foot goes off the clutch, my foot goes on the gas, off the gas, my hand grabs the stick shift and moves it into the right gear, and all of that happens utterly invisibly. People sometimes say automatically, but I don't want to say that because that makes it sound too rigid. It's sort of the way you sort of automatically switch the light switch when you come into the room, and it's so automatic that even when the electricity has gone off, your arm goes up and switches the light switch. I always find that fascinating when there is no light going to go on. But anyway, that's automatic. But this is not automatic because it's too flexible. I mean, on each hill, you do it differently. When the cars got loaded with people, particularly a little car like a Ghia, if you put two people in it, you have to do it all differently. That is, and on a hill with two people in it, it's really, you're back to like a beginner. What am I trying to explain? Oh yeah, you start by learning the rules and learning the sounds that go with the rules, and you end by doing it just amazingly invisibly. I mean, the idea that my foot is carefully doing things with the clutch, I have no clue.
Now a lot of people, it might have sounded like this is purely an academic conversation, but then suddenly when you started reading this, you had all these people who were predicting that computers would be able to think and do what humans did, and you were able to use this philosophy to prove them wrong. Can you tell a little bit of that story?
Yeah, that is certainly one of the most amazing things in my life. Now I see in retrospect that just when I was reading this Merleau, Ponty, and Heidegger critique of the whole idea of conscious and unconscious rule following, and conscious and unconscious, what they call symbolic representations of the world, that is, descriptions of the world that are in your mind or in your brain. When I was reading and believing the devastating criticism of it, which is funny because the devastating criticism of it is simply really look and describe what you're doing but it's hard to look and describe what you're doing when you're totally absorbed in something else. Like, I can't really describe what my foot was doing, and you can't really describe how you deal with the doorknob. For instance, there's so many things to talk about. Merleau-Ponty says that when you get up to go out the door, your hand is already at the doorknob. And that struck me for years as a completely incomprehensible and nutty thing to say. But now that there's high-speed videos, it's turned out to be the case that when somebody gets up to go out the door, their hand begins right then to take the shape of the doorknob. And there's this kind of, that kind of. And moreover, if you tell them to imagine that they're going out the door, their hand also begins to take the shape of the doorknob, but much more crudely and sort of generically instead of the real doorknob. So all of that was going, I knew all that. And now I went to MIT to be a professor, and this is this sort of weird thing in my life. There were these people in the AI lab, artificial intelligence lab, claiming that they had found the rules that, and the symbolic representations that would soon enable computers to be intelligent. And moreover, sort of laughing at the philosophy classes where they say, look, you philosophers have been trying to understand perception and action and skill and all that for 2,000 years and you've got nowhere. We already have a very important clue, and in another 8 to 10 years we'll have intelligent computers.
What year was this?
Well, this was in this. I was there. I'd have to get the dates, but I came to MIT in '58, I think. And that was right at the beginning of AI. They had just named artificial intelligence, I think, the year before at a famous meeting in Dartmouth that everyone talks about. And Minsky, the head of the AI lab, said at about '64, I think. When was 2001? Did you know? I don't either. Let's say 64, 65.
Hubert? I think it was 67.
That's close. And Minsky said, the head of the AI lab, a very smart guy with an obvious PhD in computer science, and had been a junior fellow at Harvard and so forth. He gave, it's in the publicity of 2001, that in a few years, I think he said in a generation, we'll have computers like HAL, who will be able to talk with you and psych you out and run the spaceship and all that. And of course, we have nothing like HAL now, 50 years later. And Minsky, to his credit, has lately said that artificial intelligence has been brain dead since it came up against what they call a common sense knowledge problem. We can talk about that later. And I even heard Minsky on NPR say that Dreyfus was, he didn't say Dreyfus was right, he hasn't gone that far, but they asked him what about Bert Dreyfus, and he said Dreyfus is alive and Dreyfus is smart. I mean, having said that I was hopelessly stupid, they even wrote whole papers about how stupid my Heideggerian, they said Dreyfus doesn't know anything about programming. I have a clue, they're right about programming. How can he be telling us that we can't do this by reading these crazy German and French phenomenologists? But anyway,
wait for these bells to
okay.
This is getting good though. I like this.
It's
10 o'clock bells is getting 10 bells, right?